Thank you very much. I guess we ought to start by saying what critical thinking actually is. And we're not talking about critical thought, critical philosophy in the sort of continental sense, are we, Tom?
No. We're talking, I guess, about a very basic set of skills. And one of the problems is that a lot of people, have their own definitions of it, where you can always sort of smell that there is something sort of hidden going on. I mean, traditionally when people talk about critical thinking, they tend to be talking about providing good reasons to believe that things are true and good explanations of why things are the way things are. So they tend to be talking about reasoned arguments and reasonable explanations. And this is very much a kind of reality-based project, and I'm on board with that. But I guess for me, critical thinking, also I'm interested in the degree to which it encompasses being reasonable about the limitations of cognition. So I'm particularly interested in bias, in cognitive bias, in rhetoric, and in the kind of systematic and predictable ways in which that thing we call reason and reasoning is maybe kind of flawed or limited, or where we need to be extra cautious.
Yeah, I wrote a little book called Thinking from A to Z in the 90s about critical thinking. And it was all focused on logical moves in argument, the various fallacies, some sort of patterns of psychology where we fall into traps like the gambler's fallacy, famously. If you don't know this one already, I should reveal it to you, but the gambler's fallacy is the idea that each time you bet on a game of chance and lose, the next time there's a greater chance that you'll win. So you throw the dice, you don't get a double six. This time there's a greater chance each time you don't get a double six that the next one will be a double six. But of course that's a fallacious style of reasoning. In the informal sense, it's a poor psychology, basically. You don't realise that each time you throw, there's only whatever the chances are. You'll tell me what the odds are of getting a double six. A backgammon player would know, they don't change each time you throw the dice. They're the same each time. So if you have one die, you throw it, there's a 1 in 6 chance of getting a 6 each time. It doesn't change when you don't get a 6, but we think it does. We get tempted by that. But mostly, in the 90s, if we're talking about critical thinking, we're talking about logic, basically, what was known as informal logic. But there's this turn, the kind of Kahneman turn, the Daniel Kahneman turn, where now thoughts about psychological patterns that are very deep in most people, if not all people, have come to the fore. So it's very difficult to write a critical thinking book. I mean, what Tom's done is bring both aspects out in this book. But how do you approach the problem, as it were, that we're not very good at critical thinking? There used to be a kind of smugness about critical thinking that philosophers particularly felt they're really, really good at it. But post Daniel Kahneman and Tversky's research, it seems like we're not very good at it. Nobody's very good at it.
Yeah, and I think there have been a whole bunch of crises. We now, in the philosophical community, you're perhaps more likely to see a paper saying something like ethicists, oh goodness me, I'm trying to say that, ethicists are not very ethical, than you are one that says, people are right and logical. So you're likely perhaps to see research emphasised about the degree to which even people who practice ethics professionally don't, when they leave the classroom, necessarily hold themselves to any kind of a higher ethical standard than anybody else. Now, I guess what I could talk about is my own journey in writing this book and in getting here, which is I approach this through technology, purely perhaps because I've written books about technology, and ever since I studied and taught at Oxford, I've been fascinated by the way in which technology increasingly kind of mediates and shapes, not defines, but mediates all of this stuff that matters, our discourse, our debate, the knowledge we build and share, our relationships and so on. And it's made something, I guess, that has always been true, very obvious, that dovetails with what Kahneman and others argue, which is that we, most of the time, are not especially rational in an overtly reasoned sense, and that when we are constantly sort of deluged with information, with emotional prods and pokes and so on, the mechanisms that we use for coping with this, the mechanisms that we use for making sense of this, are the kind of thing we might observe in a psychology lab, or the kind of things that we might turn to sort of ancient philosophical wisdom for, rather than a reasoned process. Or to put it another and perhaps coherent way, are considered logical slow thinking, in Kahneman's phrase, is something we rarely apply and that we need to be very strategic about applying. And even if we are philosophers, most of the time something else is going on. And in technology and in social science, we perhaps live in an age when the deliberate and accidental manipulation or exploitation of these less than rational sort of shortcuts, heuristics and so on is one of the world's biggest businesses. The smartest people in the world are being paid a lot of money to get you clicking like one more time. And so this sort of background, this is the background to the book, because I became very interested in how you took all this discourse around logic and arguments and reasons, which I think is extremely important, and your own book was indeed on my desk and well thumbed while I wrote it. This is very incestuous here. But how, first of all, before you get to do all this good stuff with reasoning, first of all, you need people to pause. You need people to not just be going with their gut. You need people not just to be going with the default setting of a system that they are constantly using. And often these default settings are hidden from us, and often we are continually rapidly using systems. And so I suppose, for me, all this is now framed within the initial challenge of how do we strategically seek to allocate our time and attention? How do we create spaces within our life, our habits and our relationships with and through technology in which this thing called critical, reasonable, logical thought can take place? And those spaces, I think, in public life, in personal life, are to some degree under siege. They are under threat. And I think this is one of the reasons that a lot of the literature and philosophy and elsewhere at the moment puts an emphasis on just how vulnerable we are as thinkers, and just often how fragile our rationality is because of the time and the space it requires in order to be called upon in the first place.
But to play devil's advocate, which is one of the moves in the book, or in my book anyway, to play devil's advocate, actually, it's not just devil's advocate. I'm slightly devilish in this, in the sense that I do, to some degree, believe this. You can have all the time in the world, but actually, most of the time, what you're going to do as a philosopher, as an ordinary person, is rationalise your own prejudices. So you may get ever more sophisticated at giving a kind of architectonic of reasoning, but ultimately, what you're going to do is end up in the place where you started.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess we can begin from the position that most of what we do is rationalisation. And it's interesting as well that I think now more than ever, a lot of professional thinkers are increasingly willing to call consciousness and conscious deliberation a kind of epiphenomenon, which means it's like to use a very old metaphor, because philosophers use very old metaphors, it's like the whistle on a steam train. Makes a lot of noise and it may or may not be sort of notable, but it's not to do with the process itself. And my response to this is that, yes, fair enough, much of what we do individually is tell a story in retrospect about why we did things. Hume knew this. We don't have to look far in philosophy to find people who talked about reason as being kind of after the event of the passions. But, and it's a very big but for me, when we get together and we compare observations about the world, and when we put stuff out there on paper, and when we advance reasons for things, then we collectively are in a position to do a little bit better than rationalise. We are in a position to test theories, we're in a position to develop hypotheses, we're in a position to do scientific stuff, which I think is not the kind of magical be-all and end-all that maybe some people hoped it might be when the Enlightenment was being brandished as a kind of universally heroic solution to everything. But I think there is this very crucial point that we can, by using the right collective method, come up with better and worse explanations, better and worse data, challenge each other. It's miraculous in a way, I think, that given just how flawed the story we carry around in our own heads about what and why we're doing things is, we can nevertheless put stuff outside us and collectively scrutinise this and do astonishing things, whether we're working out the motions of the planets or so on, or whether we're coming up with graphs that purport to show the ways in which we're more sensitive to losses than to gains. It doesn't mean we arrive at a final answer and we're all right, but I think for me, more than ever, it is this idea of strategy and collective interactions in honest awareness of our limitations that is sort of hopeful and interesting, and that potentially leads us some way out of the kind of relativist maze of the self.
This is really interesting because the theme of this discussion is supposed to be critical thinking for the 21st century. And it is different. It is different. The kind of thing you're saying, I'm thinking of the books that influenced me were things like, there was an old penguin book, Susan Stebbing, Thinking to Some Purpose, that was everywhere in second-hand bookshops when I was an undergraduate. And then Anthony Flews, Thinking About Thinking. There was a Thowless, Straight and Crooked Thinking. All of these books, all of these authors were saying that if you use these ninja tools, you're going to have superpowers. You're going to be immune to all kinds of advertising, all kinds of rhetoric, all kinds of political persuasion. You'll be able to dissect other people's arguments, see where they go wrong, correct them, reason your way to intellect, wealth, happiness, the lot. And it seems to be overselling critical thinking. Yeah. And now we've got a kind of reaction against that, combined with psychology, behavioural economics and so on, which is far more pessimistic about the scope of critical thinking, the scope of informal logic, reasoning in improving our lives. But it seems to be much more realistic.
Yeah, and I think it's very challenging to be realistic without being pessimistic. You can go onto Twitter anytime you like, should you wish to do such a thing, and watch the ninja tools of 20th century critical thinking and fact-checking bouncing off the toupee of Donald Trump. Should you wish to do that. It's not very edifying for believers in truth, justice, freedom, scientific method and so on. And I think realism that isn't despair is very important. And I'm very lucky, I guess, because my background to some degree is philosophy, crossed over with technology and all sorts of bits and pieces. But I wrote this book for a social science publisher, for Sage, who are the world's preeminent publisher of social science books and journals. And so I was very influenced by social science, by their body of publications, in which to some degree social scientists are very used to being on the one hand seen as the poor relations of hard scientists in terms of the data, but on the other hand being very cautiously precise about what it is possible to know and what difference you can make by coming up with better and more telling descriptions of the way people are. And so, I've been very inspired, I guess, by the idea that one cannot afford to make the perfect the enemy of the good, and that a better and more telling description of how people are, and that suggesting to people in particular strategies for better collaboration, for clearer thinking together, and for some degree of skepticism about their own thinking, these are not the ninja tools that will save the world. But I think if done right, they can, as much as anything, stop fruitless arguments. And when I say stop a fruitless argument, I mean you advance upon someone with a different point of view to you and say, I have the facts on my side. And of course they will say, well, I've got my facts. You've got your facts, I've got my facts. And in a way, we are seeing online, again, sort of things writ very large that have always been true, which is that people who have different starting points will end up in different finishing points. But how you can try and find common ground is very interesting to me. How you can, try and step back and find ways of talking more productively about why it is, in the first place, that you might have apparently incommensurable differences with other people.
There's a great example in Dr. Johnson, where, or Boswell's Life of Johnson, where there's two women, as it happens, arguing over a wall that he sees, and he says to Boswell, those two, that they're arguing each from their own house, arguing over the wall between them, and he says to Boswell, they'll never agree, they're arguing from different premises.
Yeah, I'm going to steal that.
Well, actually, they could agree. It depends which premises they hold and how they reason, but you get the point. But that is an interesting point, because people start with different premises, and they may both reason very well. They might use valid arguments. They might follow through the different counter-arguments, and in each case they could come to different conclusions. So I've come across philosophers who's, well, one in particular I remember saying, we should teach critical thinking in schools because it'll be a great way of stopping people being lured into terrorism, for instance. And this is the devilish bit of me. I don't think that's true at all. It might actually give people the tools to reason from certain dodgy, in my mind, premises to rather violent conclusions.
Absolutely. And I think to some degree, as far as I'm aware of any kind of evidence base around this, if you want to stop people going into terrorism, what you should be saying is it would be nice to have a little bit more evidence-based policy making that was slightly less likely to have people do really, really unpleasant, fruitless things on the international stage that generate more global dissent. I'm being very vague here because it's so controversial and I'm not qualified to talk about the details. But I do think that, in a way, we are in error if we excessively fetishize the kind of emancipatory potential of giving people these mystical tools, and then everyone will all agree. You know, if only we give everybody the tools of rationality, reasoning, logic, and the fruits of the Western Enlightenment, then everybody will just sort of converge on a truth. Now, if that was true, if that was remotely true, then philosophers would mostly agree with one another, because professional thinkers who considered the evidence and were really good at reasoning would, over time, gradually abandon the wrong ideas. And no, even professional philosophers, essentially if you want to make a career in philosophy, you probably find some ideas and become really, really good at defending them. I'm borrowing this example partly from Julian Baggini, who's written a very fine recent book about reasoning. But I think it is absolutely true that, you know, give people the tools of reasoning, and those tools will tend to be used, you know, as in, you know, the history of religious thought, you know, where various sort of apologetics are, you know, reason is there in order to equip you to defend your religious beliefs against assault. And so I do think that actually, again, when I'm looking for hope here, I turn towards the sort of more modest collective task of better describing the world. And if I think tools in this book could be useful to people in terms of stopping terrorism, which is a nice idea, I would hope they would be tools to do with saying, here's a description of a statistical phenomenon called reversion to the mean, which is where we mistakenly assume that something which was high, there must be a kind of a causal reason for it to descend from high to low. I'll just use this as one example because Daniel Kahneman cites this as one of the really kind of huge personal insights that drove his early work. He had a teacher at school, and his teacher said to him, or I think it was at flying school actually, but anyway, he had an instructor in his life who said to him, Danny, I have a teaching method which I know works. When people do really well, I don't praise them because I know from experience it does no good. You praise somebody who does well, the next time they don't do as well. But when someone underperforms, I'm hard on them. And I know from experience that if I'm hard on someone who underperforms, they do better the next time. And Kahneman said, it was a revelation to me that this man was accurately describing the world, but completely wrong in his interpretation of it. Because if someone does exceptionally well, statistically speaking, the next time they do the same thing, they're likely to do worse rather than better, because that's what exceptionally well means. And if someone does exceptionally badly, the next time they perform the same task, statistically speaking, they will do better, because that is what exceptionally badly means. And so this man was describing the world and mistakenly assuming that he had influence over it. And this is a phenomenon known as reversion to the mean, which is very familiar statistically. And I use it as an example because if you are aware of this, as a scientist, as a policymaker, or whatever, and if you genuinely care about this, you can then incorporate this into the methods you use for assessing the impact of the stuff you do. And there are other things like this: law of large numbers, laws of small numbers, understanding averages, understanding the idea of evidence and proof, and correlation and probability and so on, not falling for gambler's fallacy. And I think the interesting thing is that individually, by God, we are kind of flawed and vulnerable, but collectively, if we manage to agree on a set of rules that mitigates against these problems, as we have done many times in designing various aspects of scientific methods and investigations and double-blind trials and even just standards of writing, then we can effectively try to ensure that our descriptions of and interventions in the world are better than a post hoc justification or better than an understandable delusion. And so I think that is where I sort of cautiously tend to locate hope rather than in fantasies of individual agency.
I'm intrigued by that reversion to the mean example, because that's only going to work on average. It's not going to work in every case. If you took Messi, for example, he starts off doing something phenomenal, and then he does stuff even more phenomenal, less believable, and then something, he doesn't go back to the mean, he actually gets better.
Oh, of course, but it will nevertheless, and that's the law of small numbers, which is another fallacious way of thinking, as I'm sure you know, which is that using an anecdote is inevitably leads you to a wrong conclusion. If we pick all footballers' performance, you will see reversion to the mean. And football teams, you will see it, because it's the way the world is. If we just look at Messi, and this is the interesting problem, reversion to the mean just tells us on likelihood. It doesn't tell us that this person must do differently at that time. And I think it's very interesting. It's a very good example, because in a way, this is again about limitations. It doesn't provide an infallible guide to what Lionel Messi will do next. I've got small children. You said Messi, and I thought, Mr. Messi, what? That crazy guy.
But, what's wrong with truth by anecdote? I think all of us employ truth by anecdote. And what we do is we select a case study which we think exemplifies something important that our vast experience of the world has led us to think is a representative example. It's not just a randomly chosen anecdote. This is one that actually either refutes a generalization or adds further, it just shows that wisdom has accumulated over the ages. And I've seen that this person's, this is something that's a wider phenomenon than the single case.
Well, certainly, if I had claimed there was an iron rule that Lionel Messi, would never do better after doing his best like that, I mean, it's certainly a single example that refutes. We have to be cautious in the way we frame things. So a single example can be very, very useful in stopping us from making a false generalization. But it's interesting that we have to distinguish between something we view as representative on the basis of considerable experience and something that is merely convenient, that serves a confirmation bias. The very famous example of confirmation bias is the idea that if you dislike a political party, you will tend to go through the news and find stuff that confirms your point of view. If you are a Republican or a Democratic voter, your reading of the news, unless you're very, very rigorous, will tend to be a cherry picking of stories that support your view. This, I mean, in a sense, this you say it's this is based on past wisdom, and I guess there's a very important point there, which is about the difference between expertise and self-justification. In that, broadly speaking, Kahneman and others again, sort of argue that we should trust the intuitions and sort of illustrations of those who have deep knowledge of an area about which it's possible to have expertise. We should trust that these have validity because they are exactly what you say they are. They are illustrations of a general principle that has been observed over time. But we should be deeply distrustful of cases plucked out or used as examples by people who don't actually have expertise in an area, or an area that it's not possible to have expertise about. So statistically speaking, in many ways it's not possible to have an expertise about the performance of stock markets, say. You can have all kind of expertise around it, but actually, if you look at statistical projections, monkeys throwing darts at walls are about as good as many of the world's best. I mean, there are strategies that mitigate against this, as many of people who allegedly have expertise in this area. And I think this whole idea around expertise, the slightly toxic word, is interesting because you always have to ask whether or not the intuition or the heuristic is valid, whether or not the anecdote or the story is representative, or whether you are, so to speak, succumbing to kind of one form of bias or another, whether you're just seeking to confirm something. And it's a dangerous line because, of course, if someone has expertise in one field and they are genuinely drawing on deep knowledge and insight, unfortunately, they're more likely to pronounce with confidence about other fields they don't have expertise in. The philosopher Harry Frankfurt wrote a wonderful book some time ago called On Bullshit, which I'm sure a lot of people here know. And essentially he said that bullshit is one of the hallmarks of an age in which people are constantly called upon to pronounce confidently about areas they don't know anything about. It is a sort of bullshit becomes a currency. Bullshit is stuff that you say with no knowledge of truth. When you're just interested in emotional impact or kind of signalling or sort of various kinds of utterance, which are performative but don't really have much contact with the truth of things.
And yet, critical thinking is sold to some extent as the kind of expertise in a skill which is transferable across many domains. So if you've got it and you can do it, you can go in cold and get a gobbet of text and you can rip it apart, whatever it's about. You can have a conversation with someone you meet in the street. They know more about stuff than you. You can be a kind of Socrates and tangle them up with your amazing skills of reasoning and show the fallacies, pull everything out. It is supposed to be this transferable skill that is context insensitive, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely. And that hits a very kind of tricky nail on the head, because in a way, if you are very, very good at the close and critical reading of things, then you can, be Socrates to many people's, sort of Plato or pick your interlocutor. And what you can do is help people or challenge people in a sense, what it is and is not legitimate or reasonable to draw out from what is in front of them. What you cannot necessarily do is challenge the kind of evidential or factual basis of it. And you are very, very...
Why can't you can question...
Well, you can question it, but you may not have...
those facts?
Oh, yeah, you can ask that question. Of course you can ask that question. But you may not actually...
What was your sample size? Was it just anecdotal evidence?
Yeah, so you can present them with the questions, but you have to, I guess, you have to tread the very fine line of presenting the questions, but not venturing the answers. But there's a tension here, isn't there? Because what I'm saying... And I think when I read educationalists writing about this, I think there's a real sort of deep divide in education sometimes between how transferable skills really are. And a lot of people really would say that actually the most effective critical thinkers in a field are people who spend a lot of time immersed in its nitty-gritties, who've developed kind of reliable intuitions, who've got a lot of facts in their head, who've got a hold of a lot of information, who've seen kind of live scenarios in a lot of way. And so I think, in a sense, the where I kind of come down on this is, maybe it's a middle ground, but it's this idea that equipped with the right questions, we can be extraordinarily valuable sort of interlocutors to others. Honest questioners asking these questions about, well, have you, evidence, samples, arguments, reasonable, unreasonable, and so on. But that we mustn't mistake this for being in sort of possession of the answers. And we can ask those questions of ourselves in a field that we have deep knowledge over. But we cannot do what I think a lot of people are tempted to do in the digital age and say, well, because all the information is online somewhere, if you've got the right questions and you've got the internet, therefore go you. You're kind of bulletproof and you can wade into any discussion forum and within 20 minutes be opining authoritatively. And I think, actually, this is a very good point, that you to be in possession of good, useful, powerful questions to do with kind of metacognition that is not and should never be confused with being in full possession of a kind of fully inhabited critical perspective on a field.
Where do you stand on the pedagogic line? So the pedagogic issue for me is whether you kind of acquire critical thinking by being involved in thinking about a particular subject area. This is one way of teaching critical thinking. This is supposed to be the value of a university education in a subject which isn't philosophy. You pick up critical thinking anyway. You don't need to make a study of logic or a study of reasoning. You will just acquire it through hanging around with clever people, talking about novels or talking about physics or talking about whatever subject, Latin, you'll pick it up. That's a very widespread view that you learn critical thinking by being involved in a subject matter and doing it well and seeing other people do it well and having conversations with people who can do it well, because every subject has its own way of employing critical thought. The other, crudely, the other end of the spectrum is to do what I've had to do for a couple of years at Nottingham University, was to teach critical thinking. I didn't have to, I chose to teach critical thinking as a subject. So you do a course in critical thinking. Yeah. Now, obviously you've written a book about critical thinking, which gives people the tools for critical thinking. Where do you stand in the actual teaching of critical thinking? Are you saying that somebody should learn critical thinking by learning the moves in a range of cases, or they should do it through immersing themselves in a subject they're passionate about and learning to do it well? So
I'm a firm believer in, rather obviously and self-servingly perhaps, in the value of something like this as an introduction. And I think one of the reasons, to use a more personal example of, a family member of mine went to university, as more and more people do, from a non-traditional background. and got on a course allegedly specifically designed to help people who don't have A-levels and things and don't come from a traditional background go into a university. And when he got there and he won his place and he got through his foundation stuff, he was basically kind of left to rot, academically speaking. And it was sort of assumed that now he was in this place, by osmotically hanging out with smart people, having smart conversations about smart stuff, he'd sort of pick up the skills. And the trouble was, he didn't have the training or the vocabulary or the habits, the very basic habits to do with reading, the stuff that a lot of people had perhaps, certainly in a more privileged background, picked up at school or at home. He didn't have any of that. And so the rest remained a closed book to him and he dropped out. And I think more generally, I'm very influenced by work done in education, people like Ian Warwick, for example, who's worked with very gifted and talented, and has suggested again and again that at a young age, the realms of highly engaged thinking, of debate, where you are becoming this kind of self-fueled learner, are for a lot of people, a surprising number of people, kind of, those doors don't open because they don't know what words like argument, evidence, debate, conclusion, sample are like. They lack a basic vocabulary. And I think, for me at least, what I'm trying to do in this book and some of these things are keys that help unlock this higher realm of debate. A university system, especially in the UK, was originally a very elite system. And to some degree, it was a talking shop or a finishing school for people who already had quite a lot of privilege or reading. That's changed hugely. But I think, in my experience trying to sort of research and look into this, my greatest hope for this book and in general is that there are a lot of people starting their studies, maybe at postgraduate level even, who are absolutely able and potentially there engaging in these discussions and developing their own views and researching and so on, but are held back by a variety of kind of niggling factors. They're daunted by libraries. They're not very good in their study habits. They're put off by a certain vocabulary. They don't necessarily have the confidence in beginning to argue or speak up or talk. And I feel that there is a great and increasingly important role for helping people across this threshold, for giving them, if you like, kind of tools, conversation starters and so on.
How important do you think the naming of things is? Because for me, it was crucial. Like, I was writing an A to Z book, so I had to find a Z, and I had to have labels for things. But you didn't have to have labels in that same sense. How important a role did it play in you writing this book?
Well, I like naming. I mean, I think, you've got to kind of work with the grain of people's brains. If you're trying to help people, if you're trying to be genuinely useful to people, it's no good standing on a pedestal and sort of shouting down at them, because then to some degree those who can help themselves will come up and join you on their pedestals, and then you can sort of shout at everybody else. The philosopher Dan Dennett wrote a book called Intuition Pumps. I think that's a horrible title, actually, but his idea of an intuition pump is that once you've kind of given something a label and a kind of catchy idea and spelled it out to people, then that is easily recalled as a kind of nugget or module in memory or whatever. And so one of his little intuition pumps is, if you spot people using the word merely, they're probably full of nonsense. So he says, when people say, well, the brain is not merely a computer, he says, well, the word merely is a kind of weasel word there. So an intuition pump is, if you see the word merely, what's mere about a computer? Maybe the brain is a computer, but it's not a mere computer, it's an amazing computer. And so I think I like the idea of offering people, to some degree, as many useful cognitive supports as possible. Another inspiration behind the book, and there are many, was the Feynman lectures. I think Feynman was both one of the great physicists of the 20th century and one of the great explainers. And he repeatedly talked about the scientific method as a kind of toolkit, as a series of, he was a very practical guy, of a series of kind of instruments, tools, shortcuts, heuristics that you got out. And one of the things he lamented, actually, was that people became, over his career, less good at mental maths because of the growing power of computers. And while obviously he respected the value of computers, he felt that having a whole kind of mental toolkit full of shortcuts and insights into mental arithmetic and numbers and how to do factorials and so on was useful, because it just gave you more more ways of approaching problems and thinking. It gave you a better equipped brain. And so it's a very long answer, but I mean anything for me that kind of works with the grain of cognition and memory and gives people more kind of tools for approaching stuff, I find very useful.
I have to say your book is great because it's a big toolkit. There are lots of different kinds of tools. They're not all screwdrivers, if you know what I mean. They're not all spanners. There are different kinds of things to find in it.